I've been making a game for the past 8 months, and I think now's a good time for me to show off some of the progress that I've made. Before I do though, I'll quickly introduce myself. I'm Matt, I'm a full-time software engineer, that's my full-time job, and I have been dabbling in business for a little while now. After a little while of building apps and online services, I moved over to game development because I fancied a change. One of the most exciting things about game development is that there's unlimited choice in the things that you can make. You have complete control over the creative process, which creates a lot of opportunities to make something really unique. That said, it also introduces some challenges in making sure that everything is realistically achievable. For me, I knew that I wanted to make a horror game because I loved games like SCP, Slender, Amnesia since I was a teenager. Speaking of SCP Containment Breach, that was my absolute favourite, so naturally I'd want to make something inspired by it. So with a very general game direction decided, I needed to come up with some mechanics which would introduce a spin on that typical survival horror gameplay. I considered the possibilities of a game that adapts to the way that the player plays, but I ended up scrapping that because it was way too complicated for what I can do at this point in my game development journey. I thought to myself a photography mechanic would be fun and not too complicated, so that's the idea that I settled on. It has been done before. There's games like Fatal Frame, which sole mechanic is taking pictures of things. So I wanted to add in something extra, in this case, something about documenting the player's findings as well as just taking photographs of them. I'm not sure what to call the important photographable things yet, so I'm going to call them entities for the sake of this video, but that is just a placeholder name and I don't imagine that's what they'll be called in the end product. And they range from strange things to scary monsters. The bottom line is I want the player to have to actively seek out the scary things rather than just run away from them that is typical of survival horror. To summarize then, I set out to make a horror game with SCP-like gameplay with a photography mechanic and a documentation system. The core gameplay loop being find something, photograph it, document it, don't get killed in the process. Let's talk more about some of the creative aspects of the game then. I knew I wanted it to be 3D because 2D just wasn't going to be appropriate, but I'd never made 3D models before, and my experience of making 3D games, or games full stop really, is very limited. I decided on a game engine, which was Godot. That was a pretty easy choice because even though Unreal and Unity provide very good out-of-the-box solutions, Godot is open source, so it doesn't take a cut of the sales of the game that you make. Also, I can't see this project reaching the limits of what Godot can do anyway, and I'm happy with how simple and flexible it is, so I don't think there's any need to use any other game engine. I think it's safe to say that the graphics are definitely the sticking point of this entire project. I'd like this game to be relatively simple graphically so that it can run on older PCs, mobile, hopefully. But even then, I'm like the least artistic person on the planet. So relying so heavily on graphics, which is important for a horror game, is a bit of a risk. I had some rough ideas for the sort of content for the game, so that's like the entities and the areas, for example, but I couldn't come up with anything that wasn't just cliche or unimaginative. With a bit of trial and error during the development process, I did eventually come up with a few cool ideas, but it's definitely way harder than something like music or coding, which I'm a lot more confident with. As it's only an indie horror game, it doesn't have to have a super deep or developed story, but it does still need to have a story. And that is still in the works and probably will be for quite some time. I wasn't concerned about the music because I've studied music for a long time and I've played the guitar for 16 years. Shout out to my guitar channel. That said, I'm going to try and include music in the game that's not just dissonance and scary sounds. While that is pivotal to horror games, take a look at the Silent Hill series, for example, which uses all kinds of music to build an atmosphere that's not just screams and out-of-tune pianos, although they will be making an appearance. The areas themselves will be randomly generated to make sure that the game doesn't get boring after one playthrough, and the contents of those rooms or those areas will also be as randomly generated as I can get it. The obvious choice to implement this was with procedural generation, which I wrongly assumed would be quite a trivial task to do in Godot. And so begins, after about a month of planning, my journey to create every single aspect of this game entirely by myself. I started by outlining the game. The first thing was player movement, which was fairly simple to implement and honestly didn't even require that much tweaking once it was done. There's not going to be any fancy movement, so thankfully I don't need to worry about any of that either. It's unlikely that I'll add any first-person player models with arms and digits because I just don't think it's necessary and quite frankly would probably take too much time. Next up, I created an item interaction system, which I have never done before. The idea of casting rays and checking properties of objects that those rays collide with is kind of weird, but I did get there eventually. I'm not completely happy with how interactable items are highlighting at the moment, but I am very happy with how the interactable system works as a whole, and it's proved to be as flexible as I was hoping it would be during development. Now onto the procedural generation. I'm a bit sour about this one because I sunk a lot of time into it to no avail, but it does get better later on. My first attempt at map generation used a marker-based approach, where for each marker that was on a chunk, another chunk would be joined to it by positioning it and rotating it. This kind of worked, but some of the chunks were overlapping and there was no way for me to make a critical path for any cohesive progression, so I binned it off in the end. After pausing the procedural generation, I took a look at something else, which was the entities. These are one of the most important parts of the whole game, so I spent quite a bit of time making a reproducible system that would allow me to easily whip up a new entity when I needed one. With some simple ones ready to go, I moved on to the photography mechanic. Thanks to my wonderful system design, the photography mechanic was a breeze. I'm not convinced yet that it is the most performant way to implement it, and I will need to test that in the coming months. The photography mechanic coincides with the documentation mechanic, so after doing that, I made an inventory system and a documentation menu, which automatically updates when the player snaps a pic of one of the entities. They'll need to fill out some details about each entity that they take a picture of, but not too much because I didn't want it to become cumbersome. As the game's environment is a subway, I thought it would be cool to have an audio mechanic, so I added that in. When the player makes certain noises at certain volumes, then baddies are attracted to them, and no, that's not the good kind. Now for the return of my old friend, procedural generation. I tried it again with a grid-based approach, which also didn't work, albeit I had some success with getting it to map out a path that kind of made sense. Then I found the nugget of gold that is the Simple Dungeons add-on. Shout out to the creator who made that. It's a somewhat out-of-the-box solution, but there are some things that need manually doing, like creating doors to connect rooms and making sure that the contents of those rooms are randomly generated. So with all this stuff in place then, you might be asking, how have I spent 8 months building a horror game and it doesn't look remotely like a horror game? Well, I hear your comments and I raise you Blender. I'm at that stage of development where I need to make all of the 3D models. In fact, I think it's probably the hardest part of the whole project, because being creative is very hard. I'm getting there, but I still have a lot of work to do and a lot to learn because I've been teaching myself the whole thing from scratch. The models might not be the best, but at least they're consistently not the best. On the bright side, making the music and sound effects is going great. To summarize then, the game works at its core. The story and progression is still being worked on, and I don't want to give too much away to avoid spoiling it for the future. Changing the game to be more horror will be almost like flipping a switch, because I just need to replace the primitive models with my 3D models, change the world environment to be a bit darker and a bit scarier, and put the sound effects in. As long as it's all done in advance, I'm not really that worried about it. Perhaps the most exciting news of all is that the game has a name, and that name is Nothing to Report. Thanks for watching this one. I'm not sure when the next one will be, because it depends when I have more to show than just code. But subscribe anyway if you want to see more of what I do on this channel and more of the game development in the future.